why we get better change on our side of the house, and thirdly, why we get why external change is just generally challenging. The first question to ask in the characterization is, what does prioritization actually look like? We think prioritization means that even if you do prioritize sending and motivating people to join organizations from within or institutions from within, you still have some capacity to actually have protests or like have any other form of demonstrations that do exist. The second question to ask, actually no, that's fine, no more characterization that I have. Anyways, moving on to my substantive on why we get better change in the house. Now, note that the framing here is that the opposition is likely to push that there is no incentive to actually welcome these actors into institutions and organizations. However, that's completely false, because there are certain incentives. These are, one, the fact that the work of these social movements has put on a lot of political pressure on organizations and on institutions to cooperate or to include them from within the organization. Secondly, there is just a broader trend of inclusivity, because you have to pander to a large consumer base, and people do want more inclusivity as a general political trend. And then thirdly, even if it is not genuine, to a point where you think that it's H&M hiring people to like greenwash their entire company, note that this to look more pleasant, note that it's still a win, because you do get activists, you do get people who are involved in these movements into these organizations. And so the way to here is that there are certain external factors that do compel organizations and institutions to bring people from these movements, and that they are overwhelming, and they're far better than actually bending to the will of these groups or these movements in order to bring any change. Now, the first reason why we get better change is because, one, there's again just less otherization, because you pull back on narratives that these movements or these groups are actually radical, or that they're like violent or they're aggressive and they wouldn't want any change, which means that there is less otherization and it's better. Secondly, they see you more as a colleague. Notice that a black police officer or like a couple of black police officers join a police force or join the policing of a particular area. Now you're not seen as an other or someone who is violent or fighting against the institution. Rather, you're seen as a colleague, you're seen as cooperative. It is better for people within those organizations to understand actually what they're going through, what change they're asking for. Thirdly, it's just you have again a more proximate understanding point. Note that the comparative here is that you are just these organizations are usually just putting out fires whenever a social movement actually attacks them, or there is some form of demonstration. Note that this is a much better understanding point, a much less violent and better place where everyone can understand where each and everyone is coming from. Thirdly, just note that with time, you just get more representation. It means that just simply because you have people who are seen as role models from within these institutions, you have kids of people of like black police officers who might want to become like their father or like their mother and then go into these police organizations, and not just see framing on how we explain that there are incentives to actually include people from different political movements and different social movements, and that is with time will increase a good amount of representation, which means that as you get more people, you attain a critical mass, which gives you a better position to actually advocate for changes from within. Note that the impact of this is your social movement becomes more cohesive, in that now they're not fighting against this organization, and they're able to be represented in these organizations that they felt were once evil. They feel more representative, they feel more safe around these organizations, and also you just get better systemic change as you reach this critical mass. Note that our point is actually time independent, that even if the short-term impacts aren't immediate, as I explained to you the reasons, in the long term, it is the long-term sustainable growth that we are looking forward for. The second thing to note here is, why would people within these organizations actually be able to achieve this change? Because firstly, with time you just accumulate a critical mass, you accumulate a better understanding from within the organization of your perspective, and secondly, you ask for genuine change. Note that these are people who are from these social movements, they are highly motivated, and they are working within these organizations, which means that they would obviously go for better change. Before that, CEO.
Do you think a trans person would be comfortable being asked to join the Catholic Church to change from within?
Yes, I think there are, the social movement involves different people from different circumstances of life. There are trans people who have had bad relationships with the religious community, or who want to bring change from within this religious communities because they know the effects of religious communities that they have on trans people or queer people, and that there is an active incentive for activists to join these organizations because of their lived experiences, because of what they want and how they think they can interact with their religious communities or with any of these organizations. The last point to say here is why external change is actually challenging. Few reasons why. Firstly, you just place a very explicit target on your social movement when you're trying to get external change, because the best forms of getting external change, the most loudest forms of external change are usually the ones that get you cracked down. Like for example, on political movements, if you're the queer rights movement, and you have a political demonstration, it's much easier for you, the government, to crack down on you. Secondly, there's just a huge power imbalance between social movements and these organizations. Note that they do have more resources than you, they do have more manpower than you, they do have more media available at their service. And thirdly, there's just like a narrative shift in this, like because of these, because you are fighting against large powerful organizations, you're often painted as radical, and this leads to a lot of hate, a lot of homophobia, and there is a decrease in your political capital. Lastly, you also just have no incentive for political change. Note, I give you a list of reasons why there is an incentive to actually collaborate with these activists. However, on opposition side, you do not care about them because they are a minority. Nobody cares. You only cater to electoral incentives. You only cater to organizational incentives. Even if you are a left-wing political party, you are more likely to cater to a larger mass of people who might not care about these issues. You care about the institutions itself and serve them first. Now, at the end of this point, what you need to believe is that when you try to get external change, with time, you lose political and social capital, movements get exhausted. This is unsustainable because as you aggressively are carrying out political demonstrations or any form of changes, you need to one-up your last demonstration. This is extremely exhaustive for the people in your movement. This is extremely exhaustive for the resources that you have, and that there is actually very little incentive to change what you, to give you the change that you deserve. Our side of the house is the only side that actually gives you sustainable growth. Sure, it might be a long process to achieve that, but it is far better than a world where movements do expire, where movements do get exhausted, and do not have the political capital to carry on. So proud to propose.
Three contributions from opening opposition. Firstly, some setup. Secondly, explaining why this weakens the movement so that you cannot even get change at all. And then explaining why the change that you're likely to get is far less likely to be effective. Let's start with some setup. First thing to note is what we think external challenges do actually look like. We think it looks like protesting. We think it looks like boycotts. But also any kind of action that stands against these institutions that OG would have you entering into. The second thing to note is that obviously we prioritise this external change. We do not have to delete internal change entirely, but we would massively deprioritise it. And I would note, for the exact same reasons that the fee described, external change is less likely to happen organically than the internal changes. So, as my dean will expand on, we think these social movements, to some extent, do have an obligation to promote the external change for the reason that it is not organically changed. So, for the reason that it will not happen organically. So, let's now explain why this weakens the movement beyond repair. First reason is that often the most important members of a social movement are isolated when you do not have aggressive social change or aggressive external change. That is for a few reasons. Firstly, often the people that are the most important members of these societies have the most radical beliefs that will not allow them to accept the fact that they work within these institutions, the fact that they do have a huge amount of conviction in order to dedicate your time and your effort into these things. But even if you do not believe that they would have particularly radical beliefs, we would also say that they are particularly stubborn in the ways they think this movement should run. The fact that they've dedicated so much time and effort into helping this movement function. We think it is particularly, we think that for these reasons, these people are the most important to helping this movement function. They are the most likely to organize protests. They are the most likely to organize people to do these actual things. They are far less likely to be engaged when you tell them they must work within the structures that they often do not enjoy. Secondly, we would say that this is often offensive to people who do have a large amount of justified rage at these institutions, and they are likely to check out. Firstly, so they are likely to check out for the reason that these people often are offended by the ways in which these institutions have in the past hurt them or have hurt family members or people very close to them. We think that means that they are unlikely to want to work within these institutions. Or, it's like in the example of like environments working with corporations, a lot of people are incredibly fearful of the fact of climate change and blame a large portion of that quite directly on corporations that would feel like they cannot enact eventual change. Or, even if you do not believe that they will actively check out, they are far less likely to believe that this change will be useful. So they are more likely to passively check out and just go to things that would be helpful with these protests less. We will also say that even if you do believe that you will still stay in the movement, often this change is incredibly hard to see. Even if you believe that people like OG is able to get this change, we would say that it's much harder to see the inner workings of like BP's boardroom and say that, oh, well, like BP has made environmental leaks and those kind of regards. So we would say it's particularly difficult to see when your effort is going to waste and when it is not. That means people will check out. Third reason is that it is things like protests, and you do things like boycotts. That's because people often have quite a large amount of quite strong emotions surrounding many of these social movements. It is easier to do that when you feel like you are united with other people and you feel like you have a common voice, which you do through protests and boycotts. When you force people to go into boardroom meetings or things like that by themselves, they often do not feel like they can channel that energy. And it also helps you to feel as if you're doing something effective. You would note that most of the successful climate protests that have happened have been in large-scale protests and large-scale movements and those kind of things, because people feel far more empowered to advocate in that kind of sense, and that is particularly important. Fourthly, we would say that often the people who are in power, or the majority in cases where there might be a minority oppression, often will not even realise there is an issue if you do not have external protest, and that is for the reason that these people often are unlikely to understand these struggles unless it is put in front of their face, in which they do not understand why everyone is protesting and they are introduced to the fact that there might be some kind of issue. We would say that this is particularly important because it means you are far more likely to get buy-in from people who are maybe not directly affected by the social movement, because they now recognise that there is an actual need for them to be involved in these kind of things. And lastly, we would say it's far easier to attack these kind of movements because maybe for people who are staunchly against whatever the movement is trying to support, they will not be swayed by the way, they will always attack the movement. But there is a large number of people who maybe do not know whether they should support the movement or not. We would say it's particularly bad for these kind of people, because often people who do not want the movement to succeed can say things like, well look, even the climate activists do not know what they actually want because there is so much faction within the movement. And that means that people are very attracted to people who do not know whether they should support the environmentalist movement, for example, will be less likely to buy it, because these kinds of tasks are likely to be particularly persuasive. Before I go on, firstly, where is point particularly highlighted? Firstly, these movements literally cannot function without the people actively dedicating their time and their energy to do this. We've already explained why these people are likely to be locked out. That in and of itself is an enormous harm. Secondly, we would also just say that when you have far less people in a movement, it is far harder to get actual effective change. That is another huge harm. But lastly, we would say it's often easier to attack and divide in those kind of senses. So people who are not sure if they should buy into a movement or not, are less likely to do so. All this should explain to you that even if PM or OG is able to prove that they get the most amazing internal change ever, and it is theoretically way better, we prove that it is less likely to even happen in the first place. There are far less people involved in the movement. Before I go on to my second point, I'm happy to take CG.
Your own example of putting infiltration is getting someone on the board of a major polluting company with the power to vote against that polluting action and achieve change. Maybe people will put it first, but one success and all of that changes.
Oh, so this point will exactly explain why you are unlikely to ever get that success in the first place, and that will explain to you why the kinds of change that girls like us have things like getting people on boardrooms and those kind of things, is unlikely to ever be effective. Let's deal with that now. First thing we would say is often these structures do just have an inability to change, or their incentives are such they will never do the change that these movements will prompt. That looks like things like companies that are doing a lot of environmental degradation have profit incentives to do things that will keep their margins very high. That often looks like doing the most environmentally unsustainable things and those kind of things. We would say that these profit incentives are often entrenched in capitalist structures and those kind of things, which makes it particularly hard to override. But it also looks like things like the way that police force has power structures means that it's often very difficult for people in minorities to ever get to the top of these social movements, get to the top of these structures. And again, so there are certain structural barriers that are really, really difficult to overcome, even if you do try and do this internal change. So that means that it's often too difficult to do these kind of things. Compare that to what we are propping, which is a government that can get voted in and out, that is often forced to deal with aggressive protests because they have no other option because protest is a very effective form of change. It means you can shut down things, it means you can boycott things, it means you can go on strikes, and all those kind of things really do mean that the government has to respond. Compare that to a council or a boardroom that does not have to answer to any public opinion. We would say that that is way more helpful. Secondly, you are actively incentivized to block it because the people in power want to maintain their power. They do not want the fact that you would have people from different minorities or those kind of things seeking power within their institutions. So we would say that these people have an active incentive to block it. That should already explain why we flip over the government's claim this would lead to representative representation, and that would be good, because we firstly explain why there would not be this representation in the first place, and secondly, that representation would never result in the good outcomes that they try and claim. Now, thirdly, you have a far more divided movement, and that is particularly bad, because it means, as my first point explained, if you have far less people, those people can do less effective change. You have less people buying into the movement, doing donations, doing things like all the internal change that they want to prop. Fourthly, we would say that people inside these institutions often become quite moderated because the company culture of many of these places is such that it does tend to change the way that people's opinions work. And we could also say there is a certain degree of osmosis where if you're around people that are quite conservative for long enough, you will eventually start to see those beliefs as more legitimate or to some extent adopt some of those beliefs. Lastly, we would just say that even if you do not believe these people are likely to adopt this company culture, they are far more likely to see their effort is wasted when you are the only person voting on the boardroom for important environmental change. All that it should explain to you why OO is going to win this debate.
Good. First, some responses to open opposition. Most of them will be integrated, but the only response I want to do is that they talk about the most radical people on their side of the house. The simple response here is probably the most radical people on their side of the house will probably, or sorry, on our side of the house, will still protest as per their own framing. So what I mean by this specifically is that the massive action that you get in terms of the most radical action is probably symmetrical on both sides of the house. That is to say that you probably get the youth that are still sleeping on like the roads, like in the climate movement, they're still probably likely to do that. This debate then becomes about the large mass of individuals and where they specifically get changed. How do these people engage and why there's still a large mass of messaging in the status quo? I think firstly because something that's really proximal to individuals in terms of what their identity is and what they necessarily care about the most in society. I think two, there's already a large amount of messaging that exists in the status quo. I think firstly, as Ansh tells you about, the work of these social movements to the state means that there's some level of impetus for change or some level of desire for change as a result of all of these minorities. I think secondly, when you still get all of these radical actions in terms of people sleeping on roads, etc., there's probably still some level of discourse that exists around these social movements in the first place. But I think even if you don't buy that, why are people within the movement likely to engage? I think firstly because they have past experiences with these organizations. I think there's often an internal desire to change these systems for a number of reasons. I think firstly because they often interact with these organizations or have interacted with these organizations for a lot of their lives. For religious people, this looks like out of necessity, or religious LGBT people, they've been brought into that religion. For people of the environmental movement, this just looks like engaging with corporations as a result of the fact that they're all around their life, etc. But I think the second broad thing is that they often see protest as useless. I think one, because protest and demonstration often bring large amounts of harm against them, a lot more on this later in the debate. The weighing here is on time frame and sustainability. Why is it why should you value sustainability as the most important thing in this debate? I think firstly because change is conceded by both sides of the house is something that is incredibly hard. That is to say that the power asymmetry that Ansh tells you about means that there's a large amount of distance large amount of capacity disparity that exists between these institutions and the social movements in and of themselves. So I think at this point specifically, it probably takes a long amount of time for you to enact the level of change that you want in the first place. Therefore, if we can prove that we get the more sustainable policy, we then co-opt on the opening opposition on change. Firstly, on why this is a more sustainable policy is because external social movements often have limited resources. There are a number of reasons. I think firstly because it just takes a level of bravery and the willingness to go out and protest in the first place. I think secondly, this is often external to your day-to-day activity in that you have a job or you're a student and you also have to do these protests. This is an added time frame, which means that the cost for individuals to engage with these external movements is high in the first place. But I think the third thing is that this is often contingent on support from people that exist outside of mainstream. If you buy all of Ansh's incentive analysis to why corporations are and why politicians often cater to corporations, why they have this power asymmetry in the first place, is because of a large consumer base. You often have to look at donors that exist outside these spheres of influence, which means that the capacity or the level of resource that you have is often limited in the first place. And the second thing is that the cost of the social movement is extremely high. The power asymmetry that Ansh tells you about means that there's an active incentive to clamp down by these corporations or these institutions. This looks like self-preservation incentives, and the fact that you want to avoid stuff like negative discourse, the fact that you want to avoid these large social movements on their side of the house coming in and boycotting you, etc. So what you must believe here is that there's limited capacity to externally change, but this limited capacity is even hampered to a much larger degree when you do this on their side of the house. But I think more reasons as to why this limited capacity. I think firstly is the perception of non-change. In that, when you've been clamped down by these large institutions for the largest period of time, people that have somewhat engaged with the movement, maybe went to a protest or two, now disengage because the perception of non-change and that these protests are materially affecting these movements in the first place. I think secondly, there's probably likely to be a level of frustration in that when you've invested so much time or invested so much of your money into these efforts and they've just been clamped down as a result of power asymmetry or been really fucked over by a lot of these large corporations or institutions, there's just a level of inbuilt frustration that often builds over time. But I think thirdly, there's just an innate level of fear in that when you see your loved ones killed or you see these large protests being clamped down by the police, you just have more of a fear to join and engage with that movement in the first place. And then the fourth thing, what ties all this together, is that the cost calculus for every single individual just becomes so much higher. So on their side of the house, over time, you have more and more people disengaging with the movement, while on our side of the house, people don't have this active incentive to disengage because the external forces are so much lower on our side. But all of the stuff that Ansh tells you about in terms of stuff like otherization, non-otherization, the fact that people are now able to engage engage with you as a human being as opposed to an external force that you're able to label on their side of the house. So I think at that point specifically, like the radical people probably still do this protesting. On their side of the house, you just have less people who are like on like the middle, like doing this protesting, etc. On our side, you have much more of a capacity to do change. Before I move on to the last thing, I'll take those in.
Do you think a black police officer would be willing to refuse a racist order if it meant that they would lose their job?
So I think there are a few, a few things there. I think firstly, like there's probably more of a capacity to do that on our side. In that, like there's more of a capacity to like refuse this order. But I think too, and very importantly, over time, you just make it less likely that these racist orders are being put forth into the first place. Like this is like what I'm going to talk about now and why you make institutions more welcoming. I think firstly because you signal an active incentive to engage, right? So I think there's fear in the first instance. What Tom's tells you in the POI to Unch in terms of the trans person not willing to engage with the Catholic Church, there's a fear in that first instance, but the barrier for entry just becomes so much lower as you get it like over time. Because of one, the fact that you have like just people existing within the movement, but I think secondly, these institutions have more of an incentive to like cater to you and like handle to you and like make their their messaging a lot less radical. And I think the second thing, and very importantly, is that these organizations benefit from more membership. In that, what this looks like is a Catholic Church, this looks like corporations in terms of their consumer base. So when they benefit from more membership, there's one more of an incentive to accept you as like a member of that group. But I think secondly, as you build like critical mass over time, it makes it less likely that you get all of the stuff like racist orders, this looks like stuff like the Catholic Church just being more welcoming towards stuff like LGBT people in the first place, right? So I think that POI just like misses the premise in that it deals with the first instance of engagement with the movement of the institution. So yes, maybe a black police officer might like have to like carry out a racist like order in the first instance, but over time as the critical mass just becomes a lot larger and larger, making it less likely that these orders happen in the first place. But I think two, make it much more likely that you get change in the first place. And the final thing to note is, or like two pieces of weighing then. I think firstly in terms of success on their side, like it's just one very uncertain that you get the success. It's much more certain on our side when you have a proximal link and you're able to influence this change from within. But I think secondly on sustainability, when you have less of like a force that is like bearing down upon you and like less of a material hub towards you as an individual, it just becomes better for you, like, or like more likely that you get change on our side of the house. For all of those reasons, I think
DPM spends a lot of their speech explaining to you why external change is bad, but it's still incredibly unclear to me by the end of the OG case why internal change is actually effective at all. Because of course change is slow and hard on both sides of the world, except it is far more likely to achieve any more meaningful change when it is there's more messaging around the issues you're trying to expose and get changed more, when you can get more buy-in under our side of our house in comparison to the incredibly dubious and incredibly rare chances of internal change that this government bench wants to tell you. I'm going to do three things in my speech. First, I'm going to explain why we do responding to DPM. Secondly, explaining why it is unlikely that you are ever going to be able to change these organizations internally. And then third, a new point of substantive on why principally social movements have an obligation to push for external change, even if you believe they are able to achieve some degree of change. First, on whether or not there is actually going to be buy-in at all. DPM tells you that the most radical people are going to buy in on both sides of the house. But first response to this, I think this is just like generally like unlikely. obviously there's going to be some radical people who are going to be doing things like, sleeping on the streets or like getting arrested for climate change protests on both sides of the house. But I think that at the point in which your social movement puts a pressure on prioritizing things like internal change and puts prioritization on working with the corporations and the movements and the organizations which have directly harmed you, which are pushing the things in which you are fighting against, you are going to feel increasing disillusionment at the ability of ever actually going to be able to achieve change within this movement, and increasing upset, which means you are less likely to do things like organize protests or work within these social movements. And you should weigh this incredibly highly, because these are the people that are going to engage the most within your social movements. You want these people to engage more, which opening opposition, offbench is the only side which is able to achieve this. Secondly of all, they say that people have an incentive to engage because they have experience with these past organizations, so they want to help them. But I think this is exactly a reason why you should vote for the opposition bench. Because people oftentimes have been hurt by these organizations in the past. Black people have been discriminated against by the police force. Asking them then to go in the police force and then change it internally from the inside, when they have suffered the often racist discrimination policies of these police force, is something which is often incredibly offensive to them, is something which Arwyn explains to, radicalizes them against engaging in these social movements at all, and ever wanting to go out and achieve actual change. That is why they comparatively do not get as many people as we do engaging in social movements, which is something you should care about a lot. Secondly then, on whether or not you get better social change. The first thing they tell you is that corporations already have an incentive to welcome these social activists in because of things like external pressure. I just want to note at the top of this, explaining about how external forces have pushed for more people to be in these corporations is already an explanation about why things like protests or why things like external forces of activism are often relatively effective, because they can do things like change the social climate around by bringing up new issues. So I don't understand why this is a win for the government side. Secondly of all, I think that oftentimes there is far less of an incentive to welcome these social activists as they claim. First, because as Arwyn tells you, a lot of the times these companies have internal cultures which, even if you go in as an activist sort, mean that you become more inclined to this sort of culture and more understanding of the ways in which they propagate, this things. For example, oil companies often saying oh, well, we have to we can't do this sort of change because it would be too economically unfeasible, so we have to do it slowly. In this sort of culture where you are likely the only person who is going to have, extremely leftist views, for example, or extremely radical views, it's likely you're going to become moderated, so the degree of change you're able to do is unlikely. But second of all, responding to Dan's POI, he wants to tell you that, oh, if you at least have one member on this board who's able to vote against something, means you're able to agree to change. But first, I just think this is you're one board member in a group of about a couple of people on this board. It's just unlikely that you're going to be able to outvote everyone who's going to do this. But secondly, I don't think it's as likely you get to that position in the first place, because when they're doing, if you're doing things like promotions or internal company culture, it's likely that people who are going to be promoting you have an incentive to maintain company culture in a way that benefits this company and benefits the bottom line. So I don't think it's likely you get to that position in the first place. But even if you believe that that instance sometimes happens, I think you should weigh this against what we tell you at Arwyn about being able to push for things like social messaging and change in general, about being able to actually expose how these corporations are often incredibly bad and oftentimes do incredibly harmful things, and then lobby the government to be able to crack down on them. I think this is comparatively more effective because first, even if, obviously governments get some degree of lobbying, at the point in which social movements become big enough and engage in enough messaging, oftentimes governments do have to do things like concessions to these companies. Think about how the American government has had to do a lot of climate change policy on these on a lot of corporations, such as California's air taxes, which means that it is likely that this is going to happen in comparison to that incredibly slim chance of being able to get one person on the board. The third thing they tell you is that people in these organizations are going to now be more less upper right. Oh, sorry, CG. From me one. OG.
Social movements aren't unifaceted. If these radical people don't like this form of engagement, they're probably just going to engage because their identity matters more to them than a form of engagement.
Sorry, what was that?
So social movements aren't unifaceted. If radical people don't like...
So, like, even if you believe the most radical are able to, like, engage in it, I think at the point in which you're doing things like less protest or less external activism and pushing people, it means that, like, people in general are less likely to be aware of the social movement because you're doing less externally obvious things. Anyway, our use of standards of why social movements have a principal obligation to push for external change, even if you believe they're able to achieve some degree of internal change. This argument explains to you that even that social movements are and protesting and a degree of external change are often the thing which shifts societal views surrounding what is socially acceptable. So we should prioritize this over their comparative. But a lot of internal culture is likely going internal culture that they talk about changes at the point in which you're pushing people to do like external change and protesting about movements and making them more obvious. See, for example, with Black Lives Matter movement, a lot of the internal racism within police forces was made obvious to that. Incredibly proud to oppose the
Extensions from CG. First will be the decisive piece of analysis to win the opening half of the government bench, and the second will carve out an independent path to victory. Let's start with our piece of analysis that we should win the opening half. And it is simply to ask the question, what does internal change, what does infiltration look like? Because so much of this opening half is based on the premise that we're trying to get our most educated or powerful members of our groups onto boards, into the inner cloister of the Catholic Church, or into the halls of power more generally. And that simply is not the case in the vast majority of situations, because the average member of a social movement probably can't achieve those things, which I think is a reasonable concession to OO. But what they can do is try to effect change in their local workplace, to instead of dealing with the elder brain of capitalism, have to engage with their local office manager or HR person. They can push to lower the carbon footprint of their office, encourage people to carpool. You can infiltrate churches like St. Barney's, which already have empathy towards queer people and very much benefit from more queer voices. You can talk to people in your personal Bible study instead of to the Catholic Church at large to convince people that queerness is love and it is part of God's great plan. You can engage in things like police training or integrating existing grassroots programs like Cahoots in Oregon. So instead of operating those things as an alternative to the police, which I would note empirically failed each time and the police didn't to be called, you work alongside them to provide the important mental health services and de-escalation services that you can provide, but now actually have the opportunity to do so. Small battles add up, speaker. Kilometres are comprised of centimetres, and that is how close government will win today. There are 4 important notes on framing derived from this. The first is it knocks out the entire straw man set of arguments we get from OO. That is, things being too hard to achieve. It's not a realistic piece of analysis with the goals we set ourselves. Things like you are perceived as so evil and getting into bed with Sauron, clearly not relevant in the situations that we described. But secondly, it means minorities are not forced to risk their own interests or their career in the most risky situations or do the most endangering things, like CO suggests. For instance, a black police officer telling their direct superior no. So those claims should be out as well. But thirdly, what it means is it explains why prioritization is important, which is what this actual debate is about, because clearly neither side is going to give up like the one big protest your movement organizes each year, which makes the news, or the opportunity to encourage like the one white, male, rich, university educated member of your group to try and effect as much change or run for office as possible. The encouragement and the prioritization which changes is what you tell your rank and file members, who have very little opportunity to, for instance, boycott staff if they can't afford to buy a more expensive good, but can, with some encouragement, make the changes that I have just described. It is also a reason why your core message should be about that, because it is what is actually relevant for the rank and file members and what is important. It's also important to undo the sense of black-pilled hopelessness that emerges if all of your messaging is about overhauling systems, destroying systems, things which feel very nebulous indeed. So not only does this analysis knock out a bunch of the criticisms of our ability to achieve change, but it also explains explains why the prioritization element of the debate is most relevant for our side. But finally, I think this also knocks out a bunch of the structural incentives analysis that we get from the opposition bench. Because they're not really, as I say, engaging the elder brain of capitalism or the Catholic Church. You're engaging with people that you probably know. You're engaging people who are probably your colleagues or fellow members of your congregation, something which is much easier to achieve indeed. And I would also just note as a side note, these structural incentives were probably never as strong as these teams say to begin with. For instance, directors have a fiduciary obligation to consider the potential risks of climate regulation and effective energy transition. Churches care about membership and do not want to offside like 15% of the population right away. So these structural incentives, in terms of the people you're engaging with, aren't that substantial to begin with, and probably don't exist as much even in the worst case. Why is this a huge comparative win for the government bench? Two things. Firstly, because our small wins, the ones which add up, the ones which make a difference, the ones that give people hope, a feeling of success and make them continue, are much easier to achieve in piecemeal fashion than anything that the government bench can stand for. Because they need to be like overhauling these companies or defunding the police. Like that is the end goal of changing the social climate or changing attitudes or boycotting. And it's very unclear exactly how that happens, whereas any degree of success we achieve on our side starts to add up in the meantime. Secondly, we pointed that people choose like movements pretty poorly in general. That is, they choose the big fights that they have to go all in on poorly. They choose the ones which are consumer facing. They choose the ones that are the most obvious, but not necessarily the most insidious. But they are much better at choosing the fights that they should be picking in their own lives, which is exactly what the government will do. That decisively should decide the opening half. No, you've had your chance. Second, what is the extension that will independently win us the debate? It's on public relations. 4 parts. First thing to note is the problem for public relations for social movements, which is they're accused of radical and people believe it. Our opening get this far, but they go no further. Second, why does our side actually undo that problem? First, by making it harder to accuse social movements of being that, because you provide them with far less imagery of people protesting or rioting violently on the street. Second, because you undo the most inflammatory forms of rhetoric. Your leaders are no longer abolishing things or overhauling things, but instead just wanting to make things better. Third, any limited success, which I explained we are likely to achieve incrementally, can be spun into positive messages where there are any media outlets willing to hear your side. But secondly, it's also harder to believe these groups are extremely radical under our side of the house. Firstly, because obviously, and like an ordinary person is in touch with reality, and very few of the activists you know in your life are living like crazy bohemian outside off the grid lives, and instead integrated into society at large and trying to fix it. It's much harder to believe the radical messaging which you get from the opposition, or under the opposition side. And also in your own life experience, you're far less likely to view it. I'll take closing.
The inverse side is that black Americans seeking positions in police groups.
Yes.
Why is it that your side can just defend them if you're in these groups already advocating?
Oh no, we happily encourage them to seek it if they want as well. They might not get the job every time, but where they do, or where they are already having the job, that's where we get a change. Good luck proving you're going to defund the police. That's a much harder thing to prove, indeed. What are the impacts of this second extension? It's very simple. It's stuff like you get far more buy-in for membership, more people willing to hear your side and feeling more empowered when your message is less radical, when your message is more incremental. You are far less politically toxic, and you're far more likely to have political partners in a context where you're no longer preaching to overhaul, defund, and destroy everything that many people think is important. What is the weighing here? Well, less radical buy-in is far more important than the more radical buy-in that opening opposition is very obsessed with. That's for the reason that firstly, obviously most people are not very radical, so pitching yourself in a less radical way wins over more people. Secondly, swing voters tend to not be particularly radical, so the key people required to manufacture governments probably aren't going to listen to you under their side. And finally, we point out that like kind of less radical people are also most likely to be, for instance, employed or educated or connected or powerful, making them far more valuable allies than some esoteric professor at some uni who likes how radical you are. We win the opening half. We present you with a key piece of analysis to explain why we win, in addition to our two proposed.
The thing that confuses me about this debate is when each team is asked the question, what ought a social movement do? They all in this hive mind say, social change, social change, social change. It's clearly not the only thing social movements do. to do. We think social movements should look after their individuals, part of it, they should generate safe spaces to look after the most vulnerable actors in the world. Because these are the people that have been treated unfairly and cruelly by the world already. And we know they have. Every other team just talks about the potential that additional people will be unfairly and cruelly treated by the world. It means we probably should care about the people that are certainly harmed. We certainly can help them. I'll explain why we help individuals and then generate more safe spaces later, but I'm going to do two quick responses to CG, and then I'm going to quickly provide a generic rebuttal to the government about why very few people join these situations. The first thing I'll note about CG is their first extension. This debate is that this House believes should debate, which means it is a fiat debate with a policy and a model, which means this team is bound to defend its opening house and to defend the examples provided in the example. So we'll be generous in the rest of this speech and let them have their book club with the police. But obviously this team cannot provide a new model at CG. The second extension this team provides is an explanation. This is about the perception of the radicalness of social movements. I would point out this is blatant, kind of virtue and politeness politics. Centrists and conservatives are always going to make social movements look as radical as possible. And this team doesn't actually provide mechanisms for why conservatives are more or less capable of making you look radical. You're always going to have the most radical positions in a social situation. It doesn't really matter if you're abolishing something or you're just let's just abolish half of it. It doesn't really matter. Those things in the kind of open window context with politics that takes place is pretty radical in both of those contexts. Okay, first, why are these people relatively unwilling to join these movements? The first thing we point out here is in most of what the government needs to defend, these people need to actively enter into institutions which they're probably oppressed by or they find deeply unpleasant. This is a trans person walking into an institution that they believe will misgender them. It is a black person otherwise being a profitable business owner now having to work with a racist and being ordered around and stuff like that. And the problem here is that this directly ties not just their political opinions, which is obviously unpleasant to have to argue against people, but their very livelihood to their willingness to enter these activities. That is to say, they have to not only compromise students a weekend when they otherwise go to a protest, they have to compromise their ability to put food on the table to look after their families as well, because they know in these institutions they're likely to be bullied, they're likely to be mistreated, and they're likely to not get the promotions they require to look after themselves. We don't think social movements should ask those individuals to make that trade-off. Let's be more generous to CG's claim that this is about book clubs and talking to people on carpools. That is still a fairly unpleasant context. We'll concede less unpleasant, which is why you get your opening, but it isn't really a situation that's particularly enjoyable, right? If you think this person is just hiding their racist beliefs and being polite to you because they don't want to anger you as a political voter, that isn't really a reason why having a long conversation where you fully extract their political opinions is likely to be one that's particularly enjoyable for you. So I think very few of these people are likely to join in this context. And I will note that OG in this debate is well, that's fine because we'll improve things over the long term. Good response. Why did you get someone in the first place? Why is the first person willing to join the police in this context? Why is the first person willing to join each individual company that is ripping apart the Amazon to be the person that's willing to be the change that allows additional people to access this? I think very few of these people do, and when very few of these people do, as our opening points out, that achieves very little. Let's talk about individuals. This argument is going to be more generous to the government and assume people join either the book club or the social movement, or these businesses or the police, whatever it is. Why are these spaces particularly unpleasant for individuals? They are people that are situations that disagree with your very existence as a trans person or a queer person or something like that. It is a cop that knows it's going to be asked to do a racist order, and the ability to refuse it is contingent on their ability to put food on the table, which means they probably are coerced into taking that position. And importantly, they're likely to lose the social connection and the social support that the movement is otherwise providing for them. And that's because either the social movement, contacting the social movement as a police, probably something fairly antithetical to their beliefs, so you're relatively likely to be painted as the BLM cop or the person that's unlikely to cooperate with you because you do refuse an order, as OG thinks is a large benefit in this debate, which means you're probably less likely to get promotion, which means a lot of these actors are likely to choose to incorporate themselves into these situations and not instead spend lots of time in the movement, which means they lose the social safety net that those movements provided. And in some contexts, it's just blatantly illegal. You can't share business secrets with the environmentalist movement. So obviously you again have to avoid the look of providing those secrets, because if they dislike you in your movement, in that board, they're likely to attempt to use the perception of this to kick you out of your position, e.g. either losing a particular amount of change, or more likely, again, just knocking you out of the social networks that are very useful for you to achieve change. So this is an incredibly unpleasant place to be for these actors, which means we probably should not ask them to do so. Why should we not ask ask them to do so. Because functionally, the government bench is asking these people to be social battering rams. They're asking them to be mere tools and toys to achieve particular changes. And this is different here, because these people are mere means to an end when you absorb both their spare time in a protest and their job and most of their livelihood. That is most of what kind of society perceives of people, especially in a capitalistic one. Which means these people's job and their usefulness to this movement is almost all of their day and almost all of them as a useful tool to be able to change the actions of that business. Comparatively, a protest takes up less time, which means you're not merely a tool you're using, you allow that person to have other things going on outside their time. You allow them to do additional things. That probably means they can have additional agency, which means that movement treats them less like a tool. But you also just spread this out against far, far more people, because obviously the government chooses a few people in these institutions or these book clubs, and the op-ed chooses lots of people showing up to protest, which means you spread out that usefulness of people, which means each individual doesn't get extracted as a resource of social change nearly as much. Okay, what you like?
The risk of material harm of protest is greater, even if the time frame is shorter. People join and engage for the same reason, because they care about identity and the social movement.
Okay. The difference here is like a protest is one in which, in our worst case scenario, the police kind of cracked down on the protest. The comparison here is that you are you're talking and working with the police who literally says that racist visceral straight into your ear and bullies you. I think you're able to avoid the protest in some situations. You can't avoid your fucking job. Finally, let's explain why this reduces access to safe spaces. By my introduction, this explains why we owe these certain people that have already been harmed by the world's safe spaces in our context. Why do we get far less of that? It's in the context in which people work against your institution and might have to trade off differences between helping the social movement and their job themselves. More likely to mean they're forced to rat out their social movement participants. They're likely to do things like point out where the hiding spot is for people, to point out where plans are occurring, or in the worst case scenario, literally just like they're more willing to patrol a certain area as a police officer because you have a black police officer and you say the perception of this is far better buying in to CP's own virtue politics. That means in these situations, you're far more likely for people to actually have to be forced to engage with these institutions. And every team concedes these institutions are bad, so we probably should make sure that less of these most vulnerable actors have to engage with those institutions. Very proud to folks.
Firstly on the extension, then team by team. Firstly on the extension, and we give two extensions that are very clearly winners to the debate. The first is to simply point out that the characterization of opening government is that just means that people won't engage in the types of way they suggest. But why is it that you would follow the theme of the info slide and leave the job you're at to join the police, a notoriously racist institution, but also one that probably is just like not a good line of work for you to engage in, one that's likely to just be incredibly unsafe, not have very good benefits for you as an individual, and the types of changes opening government want to have, and the ones suggested by the info slide, are ones that are incredibly drastic. The reason that this is incredibly important is firstly, it absolutely wins us the opening half by far, because it explains why opening government literally cannot get any of their changes, rather than the weird way-ups we get from opening opposition. Like, maybe this sort of change might be marginally better. We explain why opening government does not get any of the change they want. But secondly, we justify specifically why is it that individuals aren't going to be able to, like why is that comparatively this difference does not exist. That is, maybe it is true you buy that sometimes protests can be dangerous, but the difference in a protest is that you can collectivize. The difference is that it doesn't matter where you are, whether or not coincidentally you have 5 or 3 other environmentalists at your company. It means you're able to join up with other people and protect yourself against the greatest harm, which is why social movements actually came out to begin with. It's so that people, like a group of people who historically didn't have a lot of money because of oppression they've experienced, were able to collectivize those resources and actually get some sort of change. But also we just explained that you're likely to experience individual and visceral pain when you engage in these movements. The fact that you have to compromise consistently by working in a framework that is hostile to you as an individual. The fact that you often have to do things that just go against your own beliefs, like following an order of somebody, of like a racist supervisor on you, that you just have to change. And the importance of this is a couple. But the importance on opening up is just completely cut that off. The second extension was to explain on safe spaces. And that is, firstly, the fact that the movement itself becomes less of a safe space because other people are likely to do things like as in when you join this other institution, you're likely have to do, asked to do things like rat out this organization, or at the very least, you have to split your allegiances between the two, which importantly, one, means you cannot get the range of benefits that come with engaging in social movements, you cannot get the sort of acceptance, you cannot get the sort of interactions and community that is incredibly important, that a lot of these people seek in these social movements and provide them with care and meaning by themselves. I think you should weigh that more than maybe the marginal benefits from societal change you might get on either side. But secondly, you need to prioritize prioritize, like sometimes you just have to make the thing of prioritizing your own job over the social movement that hurts you so much. It's something that's very difficult for you. But finally, just these jobs are likely to be ones that are very hostile to you as an individual. That probably explains why that extension is at the very least enough to get over opening half. Because at the point at which individuals do not buy into this movement, firstly, they aren't incentivized to go out to protest and get the change that opening opposition wants. If you don't have, for example, very charismatic leaders who are willing to get people and collectivize individuals in order to get change, you cannot get any sort of change, which means that opening opposition is downstream to us. But secondly, I would suggest the movement has more proximate incentives to help the people they directly can influence rather than otherwise. Let's engage with CG, which honestly is just like the most soft line case you can take in this debate. Like, my goodness me, like, come on, actually do this debate. Two things then. The first thing on specifically why that change is just far less important. And this explains why the reframing from CG as to why structural change is unimportant is a little bit silly, which by itself is probably enough to be opening opposition. Firstly, these systems necessarily beget these behaviors. That is, the reason why coal companies do hurt the environment is because it is profitable for them to do so. The reason why police organizations are racist is because it pumps up their arrest numbers. You cannot make these change. You cannot change these organizations fundamentally by individually changing racist cops, because the institutions themselves make the changes, which necessarily suggests that maybe they can play whack-a-mole with these issues that they come up, but they can never actually get the sort of change that is relevant. Secondly, the type of change on our side isn't like sort of stop-starting these schemes want to suggest, but it's one that is maintained. You constantly have protests and get incremental change over time. Social movements have been remarkably effective in the past few years. But finally, the change is just incredibly small. Firstly, the type of biases that individuals have when they have their work implement green-friendly whatever is probably one that they feel very happy about, but do not push for the other members of their group, which means the most privileged members of the group are probably happy with their very limited interference because of the fact they're never exposed to the harsh realities that the social movement actually is engaging in the vast majority of the situations, which is what collectivization does. But secondly, these people just don't have the capacity to implement this change. But what change does one co-worker have in order to get any sort of meaningful difference? Maybe it is true you replace plastic straws with paper straws, but it's unclear to me why that change is at all beneficial compared to the structural change of maybe getting plastic straws instead of paper straws, or paper straws instead of plastic, literally everywhere. But lastly, clearly the consistent changes are ones that necessarily come in the form of people changing minds. So that is, this side has to trade off necessarily the capacity for changing large groups of organizations and their opinions of rather than individuals. I'll take OG.
Because of the media, most people are aware that external protests aren't safe spaces because of the active incentive to clamp down and telling OG. Most safe spaces exist external to this motion because of stuff like family, stuff like the fact that you have...
No, except we explain that those external safe spaces aren't good ones, right? You guys are just saying sometimes protests aren't safe spaces, but we explain those family and weekly meetings ones now become unsafe because you're not comfortable sitting with the cop in the room because you were a victim of police brutality. Secondly, on radicalization, which is just very similar to the contact stuff on OG. Firstly, obviously radicalization is entirely symmetric, right? You could be radical in your internal thing, you can ask your police department to reduce their funding or whatever. You can be radical with policy. If they want to say we just implement very small changes, then you can obviously ask for very soft line changes, but they can still be systematic, right? So that's entirely symmetric. Secondly, there are a series of responses to OG that I'll get to later. But thirdly, why do people necessarily think you're radical? It's because the proximate change to you is necessarily there. If you have a bunch of people in your company seeing this one environment not trying to take away, their morning cup of coffee, obviously that radicalization is far more because of the fact it directly and proximately impacts them rather than a policy that affects a coal corporation they're never going to experience or think about in their life. But lastly, this is weighed out by people necessarily engaging with the movement in useful and beneficial ways because of the fact, that those individuals are far more likely to have the conversations that change the minds of moderates and have the sort of societal change that push you towards being normal for you to engage in the movement. Quickly then on the sort of contact theory stuff that OG brings up. One, on authorization, contact theory is dependent on you not having a pre-stigmatization in order to engage in that. So if I think all environmental individuals are nuts, every interaction I have with these people is going to be framed on that. So you do not get contact theory improves relationships because every relationship is framed as negative and therefore it reduces down, right? Secondly, organizations are necessarily scared of you implementing these sort of things. And this is a response to OG, which means their willingness to accept changes is far less and actually push these people up into higher echelons of society, which is much better than OO's company culture point and rebuttal. But finally, you never engage the critical mass. Why are you going to get enough black cops to outnumber the number of white cops and then get any change on that society? We are the ones who engage in the most realistic characterization of the debate, but also the most impactful. So impactful.
Thank you very much for the debate. That was actually quite an incredibly high quality start to round one. I think there were some areas the teams could have improved to make this debate a little bit better and a little bit clearer. So we'll go through general feedback, the call, the reasons for the call. I think the three things in general feedback is one, examples need to be explained in this debate. I don't know what the cahoots are in Oregon or wherever they are. Like, is it the quiz with the cool theme music? Like, I just don't know what these things are. And some of things like air taxes in California, I think if those examples need to be explained as to why, what they are, and B, why they're likely to be replicable across a broader set of cases. I think secondly, at times in this debate, I think at times there's maybe a bit more of a criticism of protest, but just a more stronger positive defence of why Australia is able to work. I think at times the protests become a little bit underdone and the internal change becomes a little bit assertive. I think both teams would have done more to actually explain what the process is of this change happening. And the third thing, I think, is the characterisation of how this change works, how the groups work, how the individuals in the movements are doing the change on either side needs a far deeper and far more comparative characterisation from all teams today. Because I think at times it just shortcuts a little bit or is done a bit assertively, which makes the debate hard to judge at times because teams aren't giving it full and proper detail as to how does it actually work, why it's likely to work. And then also doing the way up of why it's more likely to work than something else. In terms of the call then, we originally had quite divergent calls, eventually came to a consensus, with the first going to CO, second to OO, third to CG, fourth to OG. Let's run through that now. Let's firstly start with why CO takes the win in today's debate. I think the first observation I'd make about the CO case is that their material on how the movement will also prioritise the experiences of people within that movement and why they're vulnerable, why they're important, why they're an obligation, I think helps to sidestep them from a lot of the effectiveness clash in the rest of the debate, which does become a little bit, neither side takes a clear stomping on why they get massively more effective on change. I think we're left at the end of the other three teams being like, well, there's capacity to see change in these ways, you've also proved there's lack of capacity to see change in other ways. What this does, I think, is the most clear impact for that movement. So the capacity of that movement to say that when you put individuals into these places, well, one, these individuals are unlikely to join these places, but two, once you put them in there, they're places that are likely to be uncomfortable and bad for those individuals to exist in. So places that have hurt them, places that make them feel bad to participate in, and are likely to, work, be hurtful to these people there. But then broaden that out to the question of what happens to the rest of the movement, this idea of safe spaces. This is a bit unclear at times of what these safe spaces mean, what they look like. But I think the real clarifying example for me is the idea that if you are getting together with other members of that movement or that community, and you know that some of them are cops now, and you don't know where there are leaders who's aligned, probably does mean that those safe spaces and the question of how that works becomes becomes harder for those people and makes those spaces less likely to be involved in. So I think that then is a good way to sort of, sidestep the rest of the debate by saying why it is likely to be independently harmful regardless of change. But I think they also do a pretty good job of attacking why change is unlikely to occur in an independent sense. There probably could have been more done by CO here on why the external change is likely to happen, but I think they weighed enough into the change clash to get over the gov bench. I think the things that I'd like to do there, firstly, as I alluded to earlier, is this idea of the knocking people there in the first place and not actually reaching a critical mass or a number of people to actually motivate the change you need in these organisations to see anything happen. I think secondly, they also identify that there are lots of factors about why people in these businesses are unlikely to be wanting to participate in this change in the first place. So the idea that just because you're there doesn't mean that people are likely to already agree with you. And the idea being, I think they do a good takedown of the contact theory argument we get, from both government bench teams in different forms. And that being that, if these people already have predispositions to not want to believe that, already think they already have racist views, etc., unclear how just being there suddenly massively changes all of their perceptions overall. So I think on the effectiveness stuff, they able to get through. The one thing I should mention on effectiveness is they make a Hail Mary of it's outside of fiat to do what CG wants to do. I don't think that was probably the fairest claim in the debate. I think CG is reasonable to say, because I rechecked the motion, it doesn't say exclusively boards, it does say just being in the companies or whatever. So I think CG is right to claim that kind of stuff in the debate. So I don't think that claim falls. So what I think that does then is able to beat up the gov bench, but also I think adds enough to the effectiveness and also adds a new thing that helps get them up over their opening by having a more clear win on an area that's a bit murky in terms of a clear win with regards to the people in the movement, and also adds enough new stuff on the effectiveness of the movement, which is why they're able to get up over their opening. Let's then look at the 2-3 clash, the OO-CG, which I think is probably the closest clash in today's debate. I think there are two things here, three parts of this clash. I think the first one I want to talk about is a question of how much change is likely to actually be able to occur internally. I think CG probably makes a more plausible vision of what the change they're trying to achieve is, where it's likely to be more low level, just with your colleagues, not necessarily trying to change the board or make bigger claims. I think the first problem I have with that is that it's not immediately clear that all of OO's harms exclusively exist to the big boardroom level change. They don't also, or not just harms, but like responses, etc., don't also apply to a lower level sort of interaction as well. So when OO talks about the fact that you're not likely to see change because there's always likely to be power imbalances from like the structures of the police forces overall that are unlikely to want to allow this change to happen, when you're likely to see things like the profit incentives of companies already pushing down. So maybe in lots of those cases it does actually reduce the capacity of these organizations to actually change if you are looking at the lower level stuff. And I guess the best example for CG is sort of stuff like, well, we're not going to motivate company policy change, but motivate other individual policy change, things like carpooling or being more environmentally sustainable in that way. It's one, unclear how big or important that change is when weighed up against the other harms of the movement that I'll come to in a second from OO, but two, also how likely that is effective to be. But three, why that is so much more effective than protest. I think what OO is able to capitalize on in their responses is the concession that is made by the opening government, which I think hurts the whole government bench, that protests are already, external protests and pressure are the things that are already motivating internal change to make groups more accepted and more a part of it. So if that is true, that protests are having some effectiveness here, I think it's a bit unclear why this small level stuff can't already be achieved by this external protest stuff, or why it is so much worse. So I think on the effectiveness stuff, I don't think CG is enough to explain how their stuff so significantly sidesteps all the reasons the OO gives as to why the internal change is likely to be less effective. I think this would have been a clearer split if then OO had done the flip side and been like, here's a series of exceptional reasons as to why external protests work really well. There's some stuff there about like, where you're more like when you have political protests to motivate governments and because they have voters and things they need to change on, and you're more like to reach your message. So I think there is something there that makes it easier, that does add something to it. But I think the other area that OO is able to identify that sort of continues to push them ahead in this split is the argumentation around what the impact on the movement is of taking this approach and why it is likely to harm the movement. I think this movement stuff, so it looks like one that like your leaders are isolated, people aren't seeing the like type of change that is likely to happen because it's happening internally. You're less likely to motivate members because they're not seeing the emotional protests, etc. And that lots of people just aren't aware of the problem. So all of those factors then lead to a movement that is reduced in its capacity to organise, with people aren't feeling motivated to join it, but also reduced its capacity to advocate for change if people aren't going out there and doing the protests. I think on this it is fair for CG and GovBench to say, well, there'll still be some groups doing protests, not like we're abolishing it completely, but I think there has to be a significant drop in that to meet the burden of the government case. So I think there is a significant change in the movement harms there, which means I think the movement overall is harmed. Those two things then of like OO proving a lack of effectiveness and a harm to the movement is then weighed up, I guess, weighed up against the best positive contribution we get from CG in terms of their extension around there being a public relations issue, so that being seen as radical and being unable to get a positive message across. I think CG, I should have mentioned this earlier, does have some good responses as to maybe why you don't actually get that change in the public relations, so you don't actually see a reduction in radicalism, because there's always incentives of interested, invested parties, media, etc., to paint you as radical, so it's unlikely that you're able to fix that, or that you have the capacity or control to spin your narrative positively. But back specifically to the OO-CG split, the way I ended up weighing this out was, even if there are some public relations harms because you are being a protest group, it is unclear they go away, but more importantly, if you don't have the external change, you don't have a strong movement that is able to advocate for any change, that doesn't push anything to these businesses to motivate to have their internal change, that doesn't support their members, that doesn't galvanise the public attention to that change overall. So even if there was a public relations harm, I think the harms to the movement overall were greater from OO, and that's why they're able to narrowly take out that split against CG. Looking at the government bench then, I think this is also a little bit close in the debate. I think CG is ultimately able to win out by a better characterisation of what they think the change is likely to be, how they're likely to achieve it. But I think the problem is with this split is that at times those mechanisms are quite similar to opening government, of just like you're not trying to achieve massive change, so you've recalibrated how much change you're likely to achieve, so we believe you're more likely to achieve that change, perhaps what OG is. But in terms of things like you interact with your colleagues, they'll see you as friends, etc. all kind of seem a little bit similar to what opening government has around the fact that you'll be interacting with them, they'll get to know you more, you'll have more representation, etc. So I think more can be done to really separate as to why that's significantly different. But ultimately I still think CG is able to get up, because one, that clearer characterization around the types of change you're likely to see and what the path to that change is likely to be more achievable. I think secondly, they're able to do that, the public relations stuff I think is probably more effective as a harm on the government bench coming from CG than what OG is able to bring out overall. So I think at the end of that split, CG has meaningfully extended on the types of way that which this change is going to work, and also the harm of having that external change. I don't think I've covered every split in the debate, but I think that explains why the call ended up the way it did. If anyone has any questions, like any feedback, please feel free to speak to myself or to Ocean, but otherwise, well done on round one. Best of luck for the rest of the tournament.